Recently, I did a video where I discussed a clip from Jordan Peterson, who's not yet a Christian, where he's breaking down crying when he seemingly realized the beauty of what it would mean if Christianity were objectively true. And today, a different clip of him popped up in my feed where he's talking with Russell Brand about Christ and the beauty of Christianity once again. Now, in the clip, I thought that Peterson made some interesting points that I just knew I had to discuss. So let's go ahead and start the clip and we'll discuss it as it goes on.
The idea of mentorship, let's say, shades into something like religious worship, because I suppose if you think about the Christian world, the ultimate mentor is Christ. And you could say that being a Christian, or you could say that being a psychologist. And if you said it being a psychologist, you would say, well, it's by definition that the ultimate mentor is Christ. And what Christianity has been, as it unfolds itself over the last 2,000 years, is an attempt to engage all of the people within that belief system in a dialogue about what that ideal actually constitutes. You know, and there's tradition that feeds into that, the biblical stories and the corpus of tradition that goes along with that. But all of it is a collective attempt to specify that ideal so that people can use it as a target to further their development. And that's not delusional. That furthering of development is unbelievably useful practically.
All right, so let's go ahead and pause there real quick. So the basic idea here is that in order for us to truly grow, we need to measure growth next to something else. So it's kind of like me asking for you to draw a perfect circle without me showing you what a perfect circle looks like. You may think that the circle that you drew is good until you have a perfect circle to compare it to. So the way to get better to draw a perfect circle would be for me to give you one for you to hold yours up next to. Then and only then will you have something that you can strive towards to become better at drawing the perfect circle. In a similar way, the point that he's making is that Christ is the perfect circle that all other circles are compared to, and Christ gives us the ultimate standard of what to shoot for when it comes to how we should live our lives. When we look to the life of Christ, we see someone living an entirely self-sacrificial life, entirely for our benefit and not his own. In Christ, we see God coming down into our world, emptying himself of his authority and power, and taking the form of a servant, essentially making himself weak and vulnerable to harm and attack. He came into our dark world where everyone has chosen to do wrong and evil, and he subjected himself to death by putting his life in the hands of his creation who wanted to murder and torture him to death. And as he was being tortured and dying, he could have retaliated and used his power to defend himself, but he didn't. Instead, he prayed for those who were killing him, and he prayed for their forgiveness. That self-sacrificial love that he embodied is the ultimate fulfillment of love. And if we lived our lives as servants of other people, and we were always prepared to put the well-being of others above our own, not only would the world be a better place, but we would also grow on a personal level exponentially. So next, Peterson's daughter gives an example from her personal life that I think teaches us something that is also incredibly important. Listen to what they say next.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here, just like, yep, that was, whew. But anyway, that's fine.
Not so much, because you said, you know, before we did this podcast, we were talking about mentors, and you said that your one of the things that you've done is to pick someone to imitate and to pull yourself towards them by that process of imitation. And then when you got close, you pick someone else to imitate or to compare yourself with.
Compare myself with, not
sure, but it's the same thing. The comparison is the same thing, because when you compare yourself to someone, you start pulling yourself towards them, unless you get envious and resentful.
Yeah, before we hopped on the podcast, I was just talking about how I have, like, I consistently have, I'm getting a lot of opportunities with the podcast I have, but I consistently have my dad to compare myself to, which I think is fine because I have something to aim towards and it's kind of something to get to. And that's what I've done throughout my life is, hey, that person's really smart and interesting. Try and achieve what they're achieving. And then once you get there, you pick somebody above you. And the problem is that means you're always kind of unfulfilled. But it also means you're always growing.
Now, my own life, I related to what she was saying when I was doing music. I thought of myself as a pretty good music artist until I got around a group of people who were really, really good music artists. Being around them showed me that I wasn't as good as I thought I was before that moment that I met them. And to keep it real, it kind of made me a little bit sad and hurt my ego as well. But at the same time, my first year of working on music with them and being around them all the time is when I grew exponentially as an artist. Having a good standard to compare myself to is actually what helped me see reality. And even though it initially may have hurt my ego, it was still the absolute best thing that happened to me as an artist, because after that moment, I became better by having something greater to strive towards. In a similar way, this is true for those of us that are Christians, because most of us can tell you that before coming to Christ, all of us thought that we were doing just fine and that we were all basically good enough people, since there was no objective measuring stick or perfect circle that we could measure our lives by. But once we became Christians, we realized the harsh reality of being compared to Christ and the life that he lived, and we realized that we aren't nearly as good as we initially thought that we were. We realized that we're kind of like those that Jesus was talking to on the Sermon of the Mount. They thought that they were moral enough to make it into heaven since they weren't committing adultery. But then Jesus comes around and he tells them that if they've even looked at a woman with lust, then they've committed adultery in their heart and therefore weren't good enough for heaven. In our culture today, the assumed belief is that all of us are good enough as we are, and to suggest otherwise is immediately offensive. It's not as if this thought is even being consciously taught a lot of the times. Instead, it's just something that's assumed that everybody's absorbed from culture, and they've never thought twice to even question it. So saying that we're not perfect just as we are is offensive, and to be fair, on the face of it, it does sound like this realization will just make you chronically insecure. But in contrast to the time where I got my ego hurt from realizing that I wasn't good enough, when it comes to Christ, he gives us a realistic perception of ourselves, while at the same time giving us a radical confidence that we are fully accepted the instant that we believe in Christ for our salvation. When it comes to salvation, we know that Christ lived a perfect life for us, and he offered his perfect life as a sacrifice for us on our behalf. So we no longer need to look to the life that we lived in order to know that we're accepted by the God of the universe, which will always show us that we're going to fall short of perfection. But instead, we look to the life that Christ lived and accept the free gift of his life as a sacrifice for us in our place.
The upshot of it is essentially something like this, which is that whatever God is, the best element of him can plausibly be brought forth as a consequence of the manifestation of what's best in us. And that might be the willingness to sacrifice and the willingness to trust and the courage to love your neighbor, the courage to love your enemy. And this is a profound question. It's like, would reality shine a more benevolent face upon us if we were all as good as we could be? And that's the Christian idea. And I can't see that that idea is wrong. Now, if you acted as if God was love, if you believe that, and that would be manifest in your perceptions and your actions, that would invite the deity of love into existence. And that's true. You know that. You know that when you interact with people with love, and there's a tremendous courage in that, it makes the world a better place.
Knowing that you're accepted by the God of the universe because he loves you so much that he was willing to die for you gives you a self-worth that radically affirms and gives you a secure confidence, while at the same time gives you a standard to push towards that keeps you growing and becoming more and more like Christ, our perfect circle. Now, Peterson had another beautiful realization when he broke down in tears talking about the love of Christ. So go ahead and click on this video to see what I'm talking about, and I'll see you over there. But the next time that you find yourself trying to live the life of a perfect circle without even realizing that you don't have a perfect circle to compare it to, what are you going to say? What do you mean?